In the barren deserts of North Africa, a decisive struggle was unfolding, one that would alter the fate of the Second World War. Germany, having surged forward in the face of early defeats, was positioned at the precipice of greatness. With the cunning and audacity of their commander, Rommel, the Afrika Korps had tasted success. It was a victory forged in speed and aggression, one that pushed the Allies to their limits. But what appeared to be a well-executed strategy was, in fact, a fragile structure teetering on the edge. As the war in North Africa progressed, Germany's momentum would falter, and as they reached the height of their power, they unknowingly sealed their own fate. This is the story of how Germany's strategic errors in the desert turned a dream of victory into a nightmare. The vast desert of North Africa, a seemingly desolate landscape, became one of the most critical theaters of World War II. As the war raged across Europe, control of North Africa emerged as a prize of immense geopolitical importance. This barren stretch of land wasn't just about desert sands and scorching heat. It held the key to dominating the Mediterranean and securing crucial supply lines. More than just a battle for land, it was a contest for strategic supremacy. In this dry and unforgiving environment, the stakes couldn't have been higher. For Germany, the push into North Africa represented a calculated move in the broader scope of their war effort. Led by the brilliant yet unpredictable General Rommel, the Afrika Korps were poised to extend Germany's reach far beyond its borders, launching a campaign designed to crush the British Eighth Army and claim Egypt. If successful, they would not only secure vital oil supplies in the Middle East, but also control the Suez Canal, a vital shipping route connecting Europe with the riches of the East. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had already demonstrated his brilliance in battle. His rapid advances and tactical innovations made him a formidable force, earning both respect and fear from the Allies. But Rommel wasn't alone. Italy, a key member of the Axis powers, had already committed significant forces to North Africa, though their involvement was fraught with problems. Italy's military was stretched thin, ill-prepared for the kind of warfare required in the unforgiving desert, and Rommel often found himself not only fighting the British, but also struggling against the inefficiencies and lack of resources from his Italian allies. While the Italians fought valiantly, their impact was less decisive. On the other side of the battlefield stood the British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, who had taken command with a clear sense of urgency. The British forces, stretched over thousands of miles and faced with logistical nightmares, were determined to hold their ground at all costs. For them, the desert represented not only a physical battle, but a fight for survival, with the outcome of this campaign directly impacting the security of the entire Mediterranean. Montgomery, though not as well known as Rommel, was no less determined. Under his leadership, the British Army set their sights on halting the Axis advance, knowing that the fate of the war itself depended on the outcome. But what happened next wasn't as simple as just another battle between two well-matched forces. The fight for North Africa was shaped by a multitude of factors: geopolitical decisions, strategic blunders, and unforeseen challenges. The Germans, at first confident in their success, would soon find their momentum halted by a series of miscalculations and critical errors in judgment. The terrain itself became an unpredictable adversary. Rommel's overreach, the harsh conditions of the desert, and the lack of crucial supplies played their part in slowing down the Axis advance. As the battles wore on, the mistakes started to compound, each one more costly than the last. The once feared Afrika Korps found themselves outmatched, not by superior forces, but by their own failures that were becoming more apparent with every passing day. In today's video, we'll examine the journey of how Germany, having tasted early success, watched their efforts unravel. We'll explore how initial victories gave way to crushing defeats and how strategic missteps not only doomed their campaign in North Africa, but set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Axis powers. From logistical blunders to the mismanagement of resources, the mistakes made here would have a ripple effect, altering the course of the entire war. The stage was set in the vast, unforgiving desert of North Africa. It was here, far from the battlefields of Europe, where one of the most critical campaigns of World War II would unfold. North Africa wasn't just an expanse of shifting sands, it was a key strategic gateway to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the vital oil fields of the East. Control over this region would mean access to resources and power that could turn the tide of the war. For both the Axis and the Allies, North Africa became the ultimate prize, a region where the stakes were as high as the temperature of the desert sun. Germany's entry into the North African campaign was swift, but its planning was anything but. They needed a force that could strike quickly, decisively, someone capable of taking the fight to the British, who were entrenched in Egypt and safeguarding the Suez Canal. That force would come in the form of the Afrika Korps, commanded by a man who would soon be hailed as one of the most brilliant military leaders of the war, General Rommel. He wasn't just any general. Rommel was an enigma. Known for his unorthodox tactics and audacious decision-making, he was the perfect fit for a campaign that demanded both creativity and speed. Rommel's arrival in North Africa marked the beginning of an aggressive offensive. The Germans quickly struck, pushing the British forces into retreat. The speed and efficiency of his advances caught the Allies off guard, throwing them off balance in a campaign that would test every facet of their military might. But what fueled this success? Was it Rommel's exceptional leadership, the quality of his troops, or the sheer momentum of the German war machine? In those early days, it seemed like nothing could stop him. His success in North Africa didn't come by chance. It was a direct result of his understanding of the terrain, the enemy, and the limitations of his own forces. His strategy was deceptively simple: rapid mobility, surprise attacks, and exploiting weaknesses in the enemy's lines. He was known for bypassing strongholds and focusing instead on strategic points that would force his enemies to retreat or collapse under the pressure. His first major success came with the capture of the key port city of Tobruk. The British had relied on Tobruk as a vital supply and logistical hub, but Rommel saw an opportunity. A siege would follow, relentless and unforgiving. The British forces, already stretched thin, were unable to maintain their hold on the city. After months of brutal fighting, Rommel succeeded where many had thought it impossible. Tobruk fell, and with it, the morale of the British forces was shattered. But Rommel's success wasn't just about taking cities or capturing territory. It was about his leadership style. He led by example, often found at the front lines with his troops, inspiring loyalty and devotion. His soldiers believed in him because he believed in them. His ability to read the battlefield and make swift decisions in the heat of battle gave him an edge over his adversaries. Time and time again, Rommel proved that his unconventional methods and bold strategies could outpace even the most prepared opponents. However, no victory comes without its costs. Behind Rommel's string of successes lay the ever-present threat of logistical failure. The vastness of the desert was both an asset and a curse. The Germans, though highly skilled and well-equipped, faced a nightmare when it came to maintaining their supply lines. The distances were staggering, and the terrain was treacherous. The desert was not a place for an army to thrive. It was a place for armies to wither. The further Rommel pushed, the more strained his resources became. Ammunition, fuel, and food, all these necessities were hard to come by in such an inhospitable environment. The Germans relied heavily on their supply lines, but these lines were vulnerable to Allied attacks. British submarines and aircraft frequently harassed German convoys, sinking ships and crippling Rommel's ability to keep his forces properly supplied. The desert itself seemed to conspire against the Germans, with sandstorms and extreme heat making the movement of goods even more difficult. But it wasn't just the physical challenges. Rommel's reliance on Italian forces, who were stretched thin and often under-equipped, only added to the strain. The Italians, though brave, could not match the Germans in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. As the weeks went by, Rommel began to face the reality that the very success he had achieved was becoming a double-edged sword. He had gained ground, but maintaining it was a different matter entirely. As Rommel's success in North Africa mounted, so too did his ambition. With the capture of key cities and the defeat of British forces, his sights were set on an even more coveted prize, the Suez Canal. This narrow waterway was a critical strategic point that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a lifeline to the oil fields of the Middle East. The possibility of controlling the Suez was an opportunity too tempting to ignore, and Rommel, ever the bold commander, began an aggressive push toward Egypt, drawing closer to the heart of the British defenses. But as his forces surged eastward, something far more dangerous was beginning to unfold. Rommel's advances, though swift and decisive, were beginning to stretch his supply lines to their breaking point. The Afrika Korps, already stretched thin across vast distances, was now fighting on multiple fronts, with resources dwindling, reinforcements delayed, and exhaustion setting in. Rommel, known for his speed and audacity, was being forced to confront the reality that rapid advances in a desert landscape would come at a heavy cost. And yet, despite the mounting challenges, there was no turning back. The Germans, under Rommel's command, had pushed too far, and the campaign was about to take a sharp turn. At this crucial juncture, Rommel's fate, and that of the entire campaign, would soon be determined not by the desert winds or military strategy, but by interference from above. Adolf Hitler, sitting thousands of miles away in Berlin, saw the North African campaign as a vital piece of his grand strategy. He understood the importance of the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and the oil fields. But what he failed to grasp was the true nature of the conflict on the ground. Hitler, driven by his own vision of territorial expansion, became increasingly fixated on maintaining territorial gains, regardless of the cost. Rommel, ever the pragmatist, understood the mounting risks of overextending his forces, but had no authority to make such calls without Hitler's approval. When the situation became untenable and Rommel pleaded for a retreat to regroup and strengthen his position, Hitler refused to allow it. To him, retreat symbolized weakness. Hitler's refusal to let Rommel fall back and reassess his strategy would prove disastrous. The decision to prioritize territorial gains over strategic prudence was a fatal mistake, one that would lead to the unraveling of the campaign. As Rommel's forces found themselves drawn deeper into enemy territory, it became clear that his initial successes were unsustainable without reinforcements and solid support. Yet, when it came to the Axis powers, the vital support Rommel desperately needed was not in full supply. While Germany's Afrika Korps was elite and well-equipped, the same could not be said for their Italian counterparts. The Italian army, while numerous, was plagued by logistical failures, poor equipment, and lack of effective leadership. In battle after battle, the Italian forces proved to be a liability rather than an asset. Key moments during the campaign showcased the glaring inadequacies of Italy's military. In some instances, entire Italian divisions were routed by relatively small British forces, unable to mount a credible defense or advance without German intervention. The coordination between German and Italian forces was weak, and Rommel often found himself forced to compensate for Italian failings, using his own troops to plug gaps in the line, a strain that took its toll. With every failure, it became more apparent that Italy's role in the campaign was not one of partnership, but one of dependence. Rommel, despite his brilliance and resourcefulness, could not overcome the systemic weakness of the Italian army. As the Axis forces pressed deeper into North Africa, the cracks in the alliance began to show, an alliance that was built on ambition, but lacked the necessary cohesion to succeed. As the Axis forces grew more overextended, it was only a matter of time before the tides of war shifted. The British, who had long been on the defensive, were now preparing for a battle that would decide the fate of North Africa. In the desolate plains of El Alamein, in Egypt, Bernard Montgomery, a man with a reputation for meticulous planning and relentless resolve, took the reins of the British Eighth Army. It was here that Montgomery would launch a counteroffensive that would mark a pivotal moment in the war. The British had learned from their previous mistakes. The desert, once an obstacle to their strategies, was now an environment they understood well. Montgomery's forces had honed their skills, adapted to the unforgiving terrain, and most importantly, they had developed a strategy focused on exhaustion. Instead of overwhelming the Germans with sheer force, Montgomery decided to wear them down, cutting off their supply lines and pushing them back, bit by bit. The long-awaited moment of action had arrived. The stage was set, and the British forces were ready to turn the tide. At the heart of Montgomery's strategy was not just ground combat, but the mastery of the skies and seas. The Allies understood that air and naval superiority would be the key to disrupting Rommel's fragile supply lines. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had once ruled the skies over North Africa, but the British Royal Air Force had now found its footing. Allied bombers launched relentless raids on German convoys, disrupting their supplies and preventing Rommel's forces from receiving the reinforcements they desperately needed. On the seas, the British Navy tightened its grip on the Mediterranean, using its fleet to intercept Axis supply ships and prevent vital shipments from reaching North Africa. The once seemingly unassailable strength of the Axis now found itself vulnerable, isolated. Every day that passed saw Rommel's position weaken as the Allies, with their superior air and naval forces, systematically dismantled the Axis supply chain, forcing the Germans to fight not just on land, but in an environment that was becoming increasingly inhospitable. The Battle of El Alamein would soon become one of the defining moments of World War II. The stakes were higher than ever. This was no longer just a battle for control of the desert, but a battle for the future of the entire war. Rommel, with his back to the wall, was facing a determined British force that had learned from its past mistakes and adapted to the relentless conditions of North Africa. Rommel's forces, exhausted and outnumbered, began to buckle under the strain of the British assault. As the battle raged, it became clear that Rommel could no longer hold his ground. His retreat, a calculated move to preserve his forces, was a humiliating blow to the Axis cause. But it was more than just a military setback. It was a strategic collapse. The loss at El Alamein shattered the myth of Rommel's invincibility and severed the Axis's hold on North Africa. The once unassailable German position had now crumbled, and with it, the hope of maintaining control over the Mediterranean. The Axis would never recover from this defeat. It was the beginning of the end for Germany in North Africa. Beyond the strategy, beyond the shifting tides of battle, it was the human cost of the North African campaign that left an indelible mark. Soldiers, caught in the vast, unforgiving desert, faced unimaginable hardships. With every passing day, the stakes grew higher. For them, survival was no longer guaranteed. It was a battle of endurance, of willpower. And for those who survived, the war would leave scars, both physical and emotional, that would never fade. Rommel's soldiers, famed for their discipline and resolve, found themselves grappling with forces far beyond their control. The desert, an inescapable, unyielding expanse, became as much of an enemy as the British forces themselves. The sun burned relentlessly, the sands offered no shelter, and the men were perpetually at the mercy of hunger, disease, and exhaustion. They fought not only to hold their ground, but to retain their very humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. The toll was immense. Soldiers who had once believed in the nobility of their cause now faced a grimmer reality, one where survival meant sacrificing parts of themselves, both physically and mentally. Many would not emerge from this hellscape unchanged. Some would never emerge at all. The trauma they carried would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The failure in North Africa was not simply the result of tactical errors on the battlefield. It was the byproduct of a deeper, more fundamental flaw within the German war strategy. The campaign, while marked by early victories, spiraled out of control not because of a lack of skill, but because the very nature of the conflict was misunderstood. Hitler, in his inflexible approach, refused to accept the harsh realities of desert warfare, insisting that the conquest of North Africa was essential to his grand vision. Yet, the desert was unforgiving, a place where his overconfidence in territorial expansion clashed with the reality on the ground. It was here, in this barren wasteland, that the limits of his grand strategy became undeniable. Rommel, once heralded as a genius of military tactics, was also caught in this deadly illusion. His initial successes fueled a sense of invincibility, convincing him that his forces could sustain themselves indefinitely. But the further he pushed, the thinner his lines became, and the more strained his supply lines became. The men who once followed him with unwavering loyalty now questioned the logic of their mission. In their hearts, they understood something their leaders had failed to. Victory was never truly within their grasp. And so, the campaign in North Africa became a lesson in the cost of overextension, of strategy that ignored the most basic of realities: the unrelenting nature of the terrain, the limitations of the supply chain, and the toll on the soldiers themselves. These lessons would not be lost on the Axis powers. For what happened in North Africa did not just mark the end of an era for the German war machine, it marked the beginning of the end of the Axis itself. The loss of North Africa was more than just a military defeat. It was a turning point in the war that would echo across the rest of the conflict. For the Axis powers, it signaled the beginning of the end, an irreversible shift that began the unraveling of their stronghold. But as much as this loss marked the fall of a strategic stronghold, it also underscored lessons that would change the course of history. The campaign was a vivid reminder of the importance of adaptability in warfare. It was not enough to simply advance. The ability to adjust to changing conditions, to understand the terrain, and to account for the logistics of sustaining a military force in hostile environments was crucial. In the vast emptiness of the North African desert, this truth became painfully clear. But beyond the strategy, there was another cost: human lives. The sacrifices made on both sides were unimaginable. Soldiers pushed to their physical and emotional limits, enduring the brutal desert heat, the constant threat of death, and the psychological toll of warfare. The collapse in North Africa was not simply a collapse of military might, but the collapse of morale and leadership, unraveling from within. The choices made by the men at the top, the refusal to retreat when necessary, the overconfidence in the face of mounting challenges, set into motion a chain of events that could not be undone. It was a campaign marked by both triumph and tragedy, and the price paid was a heavy one. As the Allies emerged victorious, the lessons of North Africa would remain. The shift in momentum, the realization of the importance of logistics, the understanding that adaptability was the key to survival, these lessons would shape the rest of the war. Germany's failures in North Africa would not be in vain. For as the war raged on, these lessons would become the foundation of the Allies' strategy, ultimately leading to the Axis's downfall. The echoes of North Africa's collapse would reverberate, shaping the future of World War II in ways that could not have been anticipated. But in the end, it was the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit that determined the outcome. As we reflect on the impact of North Africa's campaign, one thing becomes clear: the cost of war is immeasurable, and the lessons learned from history are invaluable. If this story has captivated you, if the strategies, sacrifices, and consequences of war have resonated deeply, join us as we continue to explore the untold stories and the human cost of history. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth documentaries that uncover the hidden truths behind pivotal moments in history. Share this video with others who seek to understand the complexities of war and its far-reaching effects. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. How do you think these lessons influence the future of the war, and what can we learn from them today?